This is the Bruchim Podcast, the only podcast in the world dedicated to Jews who think differently about circumcision. Welcome back to the Bruchim Podcast. I'm your host, Eli Unger-Sargon, and joining me today from Ashland, Oregon is Jennifer Margulis. Jennifer is an award-winning science journalist and book author, Fulbright grantee, and sought-after speaker. Her writing has appeared in many of the nation's most respected and credible publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the cover of Smithsonian Magazine. Jennifer, it is a pleasure to have you on the Bruchim Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Ellie, I'm excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me on.
So let's get right into it. You have long been a vocal critic of male circumcision. How on earth did you come to this idea?
Yeah, well, so I worked as in human rights when I was in my 20s, and I was actually working for Reebok, the shoe company, and we were giving these human rights awards. I met a human rights activist from Ireland named Martin O'Brien, and he was dealing with the conflicts there, the Catholics and the Protestant, the Troubles, as they like to call them. And I can't do the Irish lilt, but please add that into your thinking. But we were just having really, deep philosophical conversations. And he said, well, you're Jewish, and what are you thinking about circumcision? And I very thoughtlessly, Ellie, said, oh, that's not my decision. When I get married, if I get married and I hope to have children someday, that will be for my husband to decide because I don't have a penis, right? And I hope I'm allowed to say words like that on your podcast.
You certainly are. It's encouraged even.
Okay, good. And Martin said to me, that's Malarkey, Jennifer. What are you talking about? And he said, I want to send you some information. Is it are you okay with that? And I said, of course, I'd like to. I was delighted that he said that what I said was ridiculous, because I like it when people challenge me and help me think in a different way. And he sent me, this was so long ago, Ellie, that it was Xeroxed information that came in a packet in the mail in a big envelope. And I read it. I read every page of it. And so I really started thinking about it as circumcision as a human rights issue. And I just thought, it was something that was in the Jewish tradition. It was something that all of my father and my brothers and my forefathers and all the relatives had done. And that because I wasn't the one with the penis, that I shouldn't decide. And after reading all that information and talking to Martin again, I really started changing my thinking. But it was a process. It took a lot. It's hard to buck, over 5,700 years of tradition and to do things in a different way. And not only when you're Jewish and deciding not to circumcise, are you bucking a Jewish tradition, which I feel deeply aligned with and very, very connected to. But in America, depending on where you live geographically and what kind of, birth you're choosing to have with your babies, you're also directly confronting the medical establishment. And so I started researching it and learning also the scientific questions, the medical questions, the philosophical questions, the human rights questions.
So at this moment, you're talking about this as being a process. I'm wondering if you can unpack for us a little bit in chunks. So let's start with the being a Jew and being connected to the tradition. So what kinds of feelings were coming up for you at the time when you were exposed to this information first?
Part of it is just that you don't question certain things. Like I love, that when we make challah bread on Shabbat, when my kids were little, I have to full disclosure, we used to do it all the time, and I would make homemade challah and I'd add sort of healthy extras to it. I called them like a little bit of whole wheat flour and maybe some turmeric and not enough to change the taste, but just because I am kind of a bit of a health freak, right? And then a rabbi told me that it's a double mitzvah to make love on the Sabbath, and that the twining of the braids of the challah bread is actually like the intertwining of a husband and wife. And, that was one rabbi's interpretation. I'm sure there's lots of others, but I love sort of feeling connected to traditions like that. And I realized that I was just assuming that this was something that everybody did. But, there's so many things in the Old Testament and in the Jewish religion that we don't follow, that we don't do, that we understand that that's a really important and wonderful document. But, that doesn't mean that everything in it needs to be taken literally. And so it became very clear to me when I started researching it, not only as a Jew, but also just thinking about the history and starting to learn about social issues around it, that this was something that we needed to let go of. And I'll tell you, I'll skip to the punchline, Ellie. Like, I believe in gentle parenting. I believe in kindness. I want to try to welcome children, babies into the world in the gentlest way possible. This world is kind of a brutal place, and it's not easy to transition from the womb to the outside world. And anything that makes that transition harder or causes some kind of pain or suffering to a human infant, I think is something we need to look at really, really carefully and find out if there really is a reason to be doing it. And the more as a Jewish person that I studied and looked at circumcision, the more I realized that this wasn't the right thing to do. And so in my thinking, Ellie, and I don't know if you agree with this, a baby should not be circumcised without his knowledge and consent, because it's his body, it's his foreskin, it's his penis. And if he chooses to be very, to go into an Orthodox or conservative Jewish direction, which, of course is his choice, and he wants to get circumcised in the Jewish tradition, and you know a lot more about being Jewish than I do. I'm Jewish, but I'm not like a super expert on Judaism in any way. I'm just sort of, it's more of I grew up in Newton, Massachusetts, and we weren't going to shul and wearing black, but the Hasidic Jews in Newton were. My parents are both scientists, but in any case, when you're 13 years old and then you're becoming welcomed as an adult into the temple, that to me felt like it would be the time to revisit the conversation and always give someone, the child or the young adult, the option. Because to me, it's about choice. It's about not doing something irreversible to a child that they have no control over when it can be delayed. And if they choose that they want to do it, they can do it later in their lives. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. I'm delighted also to learn that you grew up in Newton. I grew up in Brookline.
Oh, wait, we have a huge rivalry. We can't talk anymore. You went to Brookline High, I went to Newton North, and we would have the Thanksgiving Day football game, and we were always trying to beat you guys.
Yeah. So I went to an Orthodox Jewish day school called Maimonides.
There you go.
But I'm delighted to discover that we hail from a similar part of the country. That was before my family moved to Israel when I was 13, which is a different story. But I did grow up in Brookline, Massachusetts. No, this is really helpful, and I do agree with you. I agree that especially because this is a parenting decision that is so asymmetrical. There are certain parenting decisions I think that we could discuss that are tougher calls, right? So if I think about, I recently had a conversation with a British philosopher named Claire Chambers, who wrote a wonderful book looking at lots of different kinds of parenting decisions, including circumcision. But one of the parenting decisions that she brings up in the book that I thought was way tougher than circumcision was cochlear implants. Now, this is a very, very tough choice because unlike with circumcision, where I'm calling it an asymmetrical decision, cochlear implants has a symmetrical kind of quality to it, which is that like you really are in a bind because you really do have to make the decision then, and it really does have profound effects on the child's life going forward. There are other kinds of parenting decisions that I think also fall into that category where they're much closer calls. Circumcision, for the reason that you just articulated, is completely asymmetrical. If you decide to circumcise, you're taking away a choice from your child and from you're basically curtailing their future possibilities. And the choice not to circumcise really doesn't curtail a lot of possibilities. So for me, from an ethical perspective, I'm very much inclined to agree with you that it's kind of a no-brainer if you think about it from the perspective of ethics and the rights of the child.
Yeah, and your listeners can't see me, but I'm nodding my head, enthusiastically as you're talking, and I absolutely agree. And it's the cochlear implants is a really fascinating issue because I know people on both sides of that debate. I know people who are very, very strong in the deaf community with a capital D, who feel like it's child abuse, right, to put in cochlear implants. And then I know many, many, the other people, not many, but I've interviewed as a journalist, I've interviewed families that actually this one Jewish family where they turned out they both had a recessive gene. I think they were Ashkenazi Jews, and both of their daughters were born profoundly deaf. They were so motivated to learn sign language, neither of them could do it. Because they were a hearing family with two completely deaf daughters, and the cochlear implants absolutely changed their lives. And they feel very strongly that it was the right thing to do, but then their daughters are no longer part of the deaf community with a capital D. And so, my daughter actually, my youngest daughter's name is Leon. She's named after my grandmother's, her name was this Yiddish name. It was Lenka, and she changed it to Leon when she was in high school. And so we named our daughter Leon. And her friend Sierra, which she used to play with as in this little group, and she was profoundly deaf, and her parents were also deaf. So she learned sign language, and her mom and I had so much in common, and we would just write each other notes back and forth because I didn't speak sign language. And it was so cute when we introduced them because we said, here's Sierra and here's Leon. And, I so respect that is an incredibly difficult decision. And I just want to reiterate what you said. I think it's so hard for Jews to buck tradition. And I have these friends, a man who is married to a Jewish man married to a non-Jewish woman, and their son, it's such a terrible story, was adopted, and he was circumcised at birth, and he had a very hard time with it. And he got these terrible skin bridges, terrible scabbing over. And basically when he was a child, he would cry every time he had an erection. And so his association with his penis is that it hurts him. And his parents are pretty devastated about this outcome. And I said, well, did you ever think that maybe you wouldn't circumcise? And my friend said, I didn't know that was an option. And he was born in the Northeast in a hospital where that was what was done. They don't even say to you in some of these hospitals, and I've witnessed hospital circumcisions, and then of course I've been to brisses, and I've seen both of those firsthand, and so it's very different depending on who's coming to get the child and what the sort of ethos of the hospital is. But the hospital that this young boy was born into was in Pennsylvania, where it was not a question. And so the nurse comes into the room and says, it's time for his circ. She doesn't even say, here, sign this form, it's time for his circ. She doesn't even say, oh, is this, let me talk to you about this, and here's the thing, because it's just part of that hospital culture. So I think that, when you're Jewish and then you're also American, you're being sort of unconsciously pushed into something. Like when my friend said, I didn't know it was an option, and he said it was so much, sadness in his voice, and you could see that his heart was broken over his son's penis's problems, I realized, wow, people are not being given what we call informed consent. Parents are not being told that they can opt out. And what I want every single one of your listeners, whether they care about circumcision or anything, whether they're parents or grandparents or never having kids, to know is that you always have choices in medicine. You can always say, hold on, give me more time, or no, thank you. You can opt out even when people are shaming you and pushing you to opt in. And you can always just simply say this beautiful phrase like, I need more time to consider that. And so instead of rushing into it and making it happen in the first couple of days of a newborn's life, which also, of course, isn't the Jewish tradition, you can say, I need more time to consider that. And then you take all the time you need, and hopefully you'll take the time until your son is 21.
You mentioned before your process of someone presenting you with information, you're reading the information, and then coming to the conclusion that this was not something that we should be doing to our boys. I wonder if your willingness to do that, I think for a lot of people, they would have been scared off from the information in the first, they wouldn't have even read the information. And I'm wondering if your willingness to do that has something to do with the fact that you come from scientific royalty and your upbringing and your mother. Can you talk about all that and how that may have contributed to your perspective and your process?
I do think it's it's thanks to my parents in large part. My father was an X-ray crystallographer who then became a lawyer when I went to college. He had a little bit of a midlife crisis. And then my mom was a microbiologist, a very world-renowned microbiologist. She won the Presidential Medal of Science under Bill Clinton and got to, have dinner with those guys. And Al Gore is a big fan of hers. And she was also married to the astronomer Carl Sagan, whose name is much more well known than hers, which was Lynn Margulis. But anyone who studies biology is aware of her theories. And my mother was also, and most scientists aren't, Ellie, to be honest, but my mother was also one of the most open-minded people that I've ever met. And sometimes her willingness to be open-minded would also make me mad because, she was someone who wasn't going to just be sort of influenced by whatever trend it was. And so we would have these funny arguments that came about, after I understood this so much better once I had daughters who were college age. But my friend and I would say, well, women can do anything men can do. And my mother would say, that's ridiculous. She'd say, that's actually not biologically true. And I'd say, Mom, you're so sexist. How can you say that? And she said, well, and she'd, get out a pen and a piece of paper and she'd draw me a bell curve. And she'd say, well, listen, a woman who is at these two ends, of the bell curve, who's really strong and really fast can do more or the same as a man who's at the other side of the bell curve. It's hard to explain this without a piece of paper and a pen. And she said, but to say that a woman can do anything a man can do is to fundamentally misunderstand biology. And I would be so furious. And in fact, if my mom unfortunately passed away when she was 73, if she were alive today, it would be really fascinating to see where she falls on some of these issues and some of the things that have been coming up, and which I hope we're not going to get into. I don't want to get into any of that. It's so charged and difficult, but my mother loved to, call a spade, and she also was willing to challenge her own ideas and think about things. And so I chose to have a home birth with my second child. She had been of the generation where her mom had gone to the hospital, and it was actually the well-to-do women who had hospital births at that time. My mom was born in 1938, and that was when we were transitioning. There were still, Jimmy Carter, who passed away recently, was our last president to be born at home, just to give you a sense of that. And that was deeply troubling to my mom because she had grown up in this culture that said that hospital birth is safer, but she was willing and interested in having the conversation and also being upfront about her worries about, she knew that she was being a little bit emotion forward. And, there's a lot of things about circumcision that are emotion forward. We worry that our sons will be teased. We worry they won't be welcomed into the Jewish community. We worry that they'll think that their penises don't look good, or they don't look like their friends, or they don't look like their fathers. And so I think it's good to be really honest about the emotions that come up over these issues. It's very difficult to buck tradition and to buck society and to buck American culture and to buck the medical establishment. So that's a quadruple whammy right there.
Yeah, I wonder if you could unpack a little bit more. I find that I talk about a lot of controversial subjects, and I know that you're no stranger to them. There's something about circumcision. It has a different kind of weight in terms of how quickly people are willing to just completely ignore, dismiss. There's something deep that this subject touches in ways that other controversial subjects don't touch.
I'll tell you, when I got married, I started talking to my husband about it, and it was kind of like I'll just be really frank, like my husband is circumcised. He has a perfectly nice penis. There's nothing wrong with it, right? And so he kind of got this frowny look on his face. Well, like, wait a second, what's the problem? And I think that the majority of Americans, unfortunately today, are still, the men are either circumcised or the women are married to a man who is circumcised. So we have very little familiarity with an intact penis. I don't even like to say the word uncircumcised because that makes it sound like there's something wrong with it. I like to say a penis the way nature intended. So I think that it's deeply threatening to everyone because it feels like we might be criticizing their very private and in some ways, most important organ. So I think that is a large part of it. And I actually think this kind of insane push for Americans that we see with American doctors and some philanthropists to go to other countries and circumcise men and, circumcised boys, I think that has to do with this fundamental feeling of like, I want to justify the way my penis looks because it's too, and feels and acts, because it's too painful to think that they were mutilated. And Ellie, I lived and worked in West Africa, and I lived and worked in Muslim countries and have spent quite a bit of time. And there are many countries that do female genital mutilation. We don't even call it female circumcision. We call it genital mutilation. And what people, and in Somalia, for example, that can be the most devastating operation where they actually scoop out the entire clitoris. I have one person that I interviewed that her dad didn't want her to get it. Her mother took her there, didn't tell her what was going on, and they literally fed her entire clitoris to the wild dogs. I mean, literally, this is what happened. And then they sewed up her vagina so tight, and it's terrible. But there are other places where they do female, quote, circumcision, which of course we're going to call genital mutilation, where they don't do that. They do a partial, or they do a nick, or they do something, as a rite of passage, but they don't take away all of your pleasure. The truth is, when you circumcise a man, you are taking away some of his sexual pleasure. And it's not to say that there aren't sometimes medical reasons that a man might have to be circumcised, but that's devastating. Your penis is a wonderful part of your body. You want to enjoy it. You want to really have a good time with it. You want to share it with your partner in consensual and loving and wonderful ways. You want to use it to procreate. The idea that we would be taking sensitive tissue and somehow compromising our way of feeling pleasure, that's so unbelievably painful. And it was painful to my husband because he's like me. He has a scientific mind. I said, would you be willing just to read about this? Would you be willing to talk about it? And he said, yeah. And he sat down and he spent hours and hours, Ellie. And the whole time he was reading about it, he had this, like, his expression got sadder and sadder and sadder. And he read all this material, and it was just sort of informative, and he read all this material and he said, wow, I really wish this hadn't been done to me. He said, I had no idea. And he said, he was completely convinced. He's like, again, it's going to be our son's choice. If we are lucky enough to be blessed with a boy, we are going to let him make that choice. So, and then the same thing comes up, Ellie, and interrupt me if I'm talking too much. But
no, this is great. Please keep going.
The same thing comes up with women who are married to men who are circumcised because, like, they're having a perfectly wonderful sex life. They enjoy I hope, but no, I know some women don't, but I hope that they're enjoying their men's private parts, right? And they don't want to think that something is wrong with their man or something could be better about their sex life because they have no control over it. So it's much easier to just keep perpetuating a cycle, which it's a cycle of violence and mutilation. I hate to say it that way because I know that I believe that no one in the Jewish community is doing this to perpetuate violence or mutilation. And I know it's really hard to use those words with people who have done this maybe to a baby or are thinking of doing it or have had it done to them. But we are truly perpetuating a cycle of violence. We're taking away sexual pleasure. We're making the association for a baby of pain in their private areas. And that all feels so wrong to me.
I hear you. I'm wondering what your take is on some of the legislative initiatives of people trying to sort of ban circumcision. What do you think about that? Like, sort of just from an ethical perspective, and then what do you think about that from a tactical perspective?
I think that the best way to stop this practice sort of overnight would be for insurance companies to stop paying for it. And so, I think that we really, that finances are a big incentive in all things to do with medicine, and that I have mixed feelings about legislation and trying to ban it from the sort of top down. And it's not that I'm necessarily against that. It's that I just think that when we educate people, the minute you take away the financial incentive, you take away the pressure to do it, and you add in some education, it's like, to me, I wouldn't legislate breastfeeding. We know that a breastfed baby is going to do better on every outcome than a formula-fed baby. And we know, I mean, we have literally thousands of peer-reviewed studies that show the benefits to the immune system, to the brain development, to the IQ of the baby, to the feelings of attachment, to everything, right, Ellie? But we wouldn't do what they were doing in, I think it was in the United Arab Emirates. We wouldn't put a woman in jail for not, literally, we wouldn't threaten a woman with jail time for not breastfeeding. And I'm not sure that this is the right analogy. So I am willing to, be called, you can call malarkey on me if you disagree, because I don't truly know. But I think that it's so much more effective if we can educate people and empower parents to make really good, gentle decisions and not actually do it from a top-down legislation point of view. But I'm also somebody who tends to prefer to have less government intervention in a family's life, especially when it comes to their health and well-being, because when I see the American government intervening, I see a lot of bad things starting to happen. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. The way I think about this is just a little bit different, but basically I arrive at the same conclusion, which is I can't articulate a good reason why routine male infant circumcision should be legal. Like, I honestly could not come up with a good argument for that. Having said that, I've watched initiative after initiative fail and backfire over the last 2 decades. And so tactically, I think it's just incredibly unwise. Part of that has to do with the way the legal system works in the United States. And you're always going to run up against freedom of religion here, especially initiatives that don't have a religious exemption, which most of them have been until this point. So I just think tactically it's foolish. And I also agree with you that I think the better bet is persuasion and education. And again, I'm focusing on the United States here, but like, we don't like government overreach in this country. There's like a culture against that here. So sort of trying to get something like that through, I think on some level is out of step with the way Americans think of themselves and is less likely to succeed for that reason.
Yeah, that's been my impression as well. And I remember at an Intact America conference, I think this was in 2013, there was a doula who gave a talk and it was wonderful. And she talked about how a lot of her clients would come and she was in the hospital and home births she would attend. And she talked about how a lot of her clients would come in and they would be uncertain. And she would not give them her opinion. She would just present them with the information. And she literally, I remember this so well because she got a standing ovation. She said that literally 100% of the clients through her education and just presenting them with information chose to leave their sons intact. And, that's a very high success rate. And that's what I would hope. What I would hope is that we let the boy decide when he's old enough to choose.
We've covered a lot. Is there anything else that you'd like our audience to think about as we end our conversation?
Yeah, I mean, we said this before, but it's worth reiterating. You can't undo something that you've done when it involves, taking something away from your baby, but you can always change your mind later. So I just want to reiterate when people are thinking through that these are difficult issues. They bring up a lot of different feelings and it's hard, to swim against the tide. But you can always just think in your mind, I'm going to decide later. And when someone is pressing you and pushing you to do something right now or else, if you don't do this now, this will happen to your baby. That's a scare tactic that should put up a red flag. And that would be about, any issue in medicine. Don't let people scare you and don't let them rush you into things.
Dr. Margulis, this has been such a pleasure. Thank you for your time. Where can people find your work?
Thank you for having me. The best way is on Substack, which is I have a channel that's called Vibrant Life. And so if you just Google Jennifer Margulis Vibrant Life, you can subscribe to it. And that means that you'll get an email from me, kind of an email newsletter once a week, or you can just get my articles there on the web. So that's a nice way to be in touch. And then I do have a website, which is www.jennifermargulis.net.
Thank you so much for being a guest on the Bruchim podcast.
Thank you for having me, Ellie. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for listening to the Bruchim podcast. If you like what you've heard, please go on over to our website, bruchim.online. That's BRUCHIM.online, and consider supporting our organization. We're a 501c3, so all donations are tax deductible. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, feel free to email us at info@bruchim.online. Lehitraot.